Hello everybody and welcome back from a well-earned break. My name's Kate Kennedy and I'm the Associate Director here at the Life Writing Centre in Wolfson College in Oxford, and we're absolutely delighted to welcome Carmen to this fantastic conference. She has been a great friend to the Life Writing Centre since she was a Creative Arts Fellow here a few years ago now, and has been a big contributor to our events. So it's very, very fitting that she's a major part of this conference. And let me tell you a little bit about her. She was the George Orwell Prize Fellow. She's written 4 poetry collections. Her most recent book is Poetry in the Language of Oppression, which has just come out from OUP. She's also written a memoir, which is wonderful, a monograph on Seamus Heaney, and a book on Eastern European poetry in translation. She's taught at Michigan, in Switzerland, the University of Freiburg, as well as in the continuing education department here at Oxford, and currently teaches in Manhattan. I can't think of anybody better qualified to talk on poetry and ethics and images and its relationship also to life writing, which I'm particularly fascinated to hear a little bit about, how poetry takes a holistic view of the person, is a great challenge to us biographers. and I can't wait to hear what you're going to tell us, Carmen.
Today I want to talk, the name of the talk, the title is The Soul in Paraphrase, Sources of Poetic Language. I want to start with the definition of poetry as the soul in paraphrase, which I borrowed from a poem by George Herbert that I will discuss shortly, and then discuss research as one of the sources of poetic inspiration, and more specifically as a source of poetic language. The idea that poetry is an articulation of the soul, that hard to define but defining aspect of ourselves that connects the seen with the unseen, the concrete with the glimpsed, the real world with a world of dreams, is very appealing to me because it represents a frontier of language. Poets have the unique freedom to explore various meanings of sounds, of words, to break rules and to go further in language where they can reveal, illuminate, invent, discover, reimagine, describe, and ultimately inspire. Their fodder is figurative language, where the real meets the imagined and where the language is transformed. The source of figurative language, though, is the world around us, in the knowledge that comes from all areas of human occupation and preoccupations. So the terms of comparison of one thing to another come from science, politics, history, medicine, and so on. Because poetry takes a holistic view of the person, it provides the richest expressions of the complexity of the human experience in language. But for a poem to truly communicate, it must have a certain naturalness and spontaneity about its language and thoughts, an ease about the soul in paraphrase and something understood, as George Herbert put it, and as Alexander Pope explained in his Craft of Writing, in an essay on criticism, true ease in writing comes from art, not chance, as those move easiest who have learned to dance. So here we have music, language, meaning, research, everything coming in together to give us that sense of the unseen that communicates between all of us. So let me start a bit to talk about George Herbert's poem in sense of poetry and religion and religion as a source of poetic language and inspiration. The expression, the soul in paraphrase, which I find stunningly beautiful, comes from the poem Prayer 1 by George Herbert, where he attempts an all-encompassing definition of prayer, where music and words seem to hold the soul as it experiences the yearning for the divine. This view of prayer as an expression of the soul, in paraphrase, of, he says, the heart in pilgrimage. How beautiful that image, the heart in pilgrimage. Or another quote, softness and peace and joy and love and bliss. And also he says, heaven in ordinary and the Milky Way, and then church bells beyond the stars heard, the soul's blood, culminating with something understood. This definition is certainly very reassuring and appealing and spiritually rooting to the believer. But the excerpts from the poem I quoted here, having taken them out of their particular doctrinal context on which Herbert placed them in his moment of inspiration, are well suited for poetry simply as a beautiful manifestation of language, especially if we bear in mind the deep, ancient relationship between poetry and prayer as human expressions that seek a communion with that which we perceive beyond our personal circumstances, intimating the sense of being alive in a world and the universe beyond it, which we don't quite comprehend. Now, Herbert composed a poem entitled Prayer, which is doctrinal, but the poem itself is not a prayer commonly recited in churches, and it is available to all faiths and no faith at all, for the sheer joy of language and inspiration about something understood that one individual poet shared. And I think in a talk that we just heard before with the other speakers, we had that sense that one shares his or her own understanding of the world. We communicate with Herbert beyond the requirements of doctrine and faith, language making it possible to reach deeper into ourselves as a community held by language, not necessarily by religion. And yet we are invited to come closer to a spiritual contemplation about our own soul and its pilgrimage, and about how prayer might be the very soul, in paraphrase, the closest we can come to feeling it in words. This is because the language borrowed from religion and religious practice is brought into a private expression of yearning. Eliot's complex and wide-ranging poem, Little Gidding, comes to mind, specifically the lines, "And prayer is more than an order of words, the conscious occupation of the praying mind, where the sound of the voice praying." There again, we have the religious imagery and language suffusing the language of poetry to construct and extend metaphor of human yearning to understand existence. Eliot seems to suggest that thought, voice, and order of words need to be taken all together, not separately, to articulate the prayer, which is more than the sum of all of its components. To me, poetry, like prayer, is active language. It finds the reader in one place and it leaves him or her in another, surprised, delighted, yearning for more, and hopefully wiser and more appreciative of the power of language to connect all of us across the various social, economic, or religious divides. It is for this reason that I would like to borrow Herbert's expression, the soul, in paraphrase, and define poetry in this way. To this, I'd also add Pablo Neruda's words from his Nobel Prize speech towards the splendid city, where he says, and I quote, "I believe that poetry is an action, ephemeral or solemn, in which there enter as equal partners solitude and solidarity, emotion and action, the nearness to oneself, the nearness to mankind, and to the secret manifestations of nature." And here, I'd like to move on to one of the secret manifestations of nature, which is our sense of wonder about nature and about the way nature reveals itself to us. And we have an intersection between poetry and science. The intersection between poetry and science happens on a sense of wonder and mutual fascination. I'd like to talk a bit more about this. My husband happens to be a particle physicist, and I've been spending the last 10 years thinking about the tiniest particles ever discovered, and seeing sort of metaphorical explosions in their characters and in the way in which they behave. So how is poetry the soul in paraphrase in relation to science? Let's have a look at Walt Whitman's expression of wonder in his poem, When I Heard the Learned Astronomer. It's a poem I often read to my kids, and I really love it. Here's the poem. When I heard the learned astronomer, when the proofs, the figures were arranged in columns before me, when I was shown the charts and diagrams to add, divide, and measure them, when I, sitting, heard the astronomer where he lectured with much applause in the lecture room, how soon unaccountable I became, tired and sick, till rising and gliding out, I wandered off by myself in the mystical, moist night air, and from time to time looked up in perfect silence at the stars. The scientific language here entered the poem to express the sense of wonder about the mysteries of the universe as explored and explained by scientists. Whitman is playing on the dichotomy between objective and subjective, and between factual and suggestive, replaying the long-standing conflict between science and literature, the rational versus the expressive, colored by feelings, as he returns to expressing that sense of mystery and wonder, and perhaps also the inscrutability of the universe, as it sits in perfect silence above the poet, a wistful soul in a night moist air. But this does not mean that poets cannot observe, and there's not a mutual fascination of scientists with poets. The ancient Greek poet Sappho seems to have described the Pleiades quite accurately from her island of Lesbos, as she expressed an yearning and a loneliness under the night sky. Using modern day software, astronomers here in the States were able to date her poem based on her description of the night sky. Here is Sappho's poem in the translation of Wharton, 1887. Midnight poem. The moon has set, and the Pleiades. It is midnight. Time is going by, and I sleep alone. The astronomers used the brightest star of the cluster of the Pleiades. The name of the star is Alcyone, located near the geometrical center of the most prominent part of the cluster. The astronomers say that the star constitutes an adequate object of reference for recording the rising and setting of the Pleiades. And they dated the poem. The date of composition was established between winter and spring of 570 BC, when the Pleiades set before midnight from 25 January on, and were lost to the evening twilight completely by 6 April. So I will put a link to the full article that was published about this into the comments later on. But my point is that here astronomy meets ancient poetry. Again, the poetry, which is the soul in paraphrase, taking its language from the sky. Research meets poetry, poetry meets research. Poets have always looked at the immense beauty of the sky and found inspiration to ponder our place in the universe. The words of praise for the sun, the moon, and stars bring this beauty closer to our hearts. It is no surprise that astronomers and particle physicists, although they deploy the abstract language of mathematics, are often concerned with the same questions. There is much profit in bringing science and poetry together, not only for expanding the language and accuracy in observation, in poetic statements and poetic figures, but through this, in our understanding of our place in the universe, beyond our personal language, beyond the grammar of our griefs, but in a language of wonder. And so this, to me, this intersection is quite fascinating because it brings us all together in a place of learning, which I find as a source, both for research inquiry. How is this like this? Why is the world the way it is? And also for poets who are trying to put this beautiful language to explain in the way they understand it. And I'd like to end this talk with the section on poetry and history, because this is where my work takes place as a poet. I was talking earlier on with Amit about the role of documents and documenting history in poetry, and how poetry can become a literary testimony. Now we know Wilfred Owen's, he wrote about the pity of war as the primary concern of his poems, and the poetry's participation in history through witnessing both the sinister and heroic manifestations of the human nature in language. The poetry is in the pity, Owen said about his work. And to me, again, this kind of poetry in particular, in the pity, is the soul in paraphrase, because it shows language active again, as in Neruda's sense of nearness to mankind, to acknowledge and perhaps also generate feelings that would help us orient ourselves against self-destruction. This is where we have poetry as a force for positive social change, not necessarily in sort of politicized, simplistic way, but in a sense of showing the canvas of suffering that we put each other through. And I think this is something very unique to poetry and the way it interacts with historical upheaval. My own work with the Cold War secret police family archives exposed the language of surveillance as particularly destructive aspect of public language, against which the language of feelings and personal identity had to be defined emotionally, spiritually, and historically. I included this technical surveillance terminology straight from the files in the fabric of the lyric language. My book of poems, Releasing the Porcelain Birds, Poems After Surveillance, is a personal expression of historical experience that witnesses to a particular aspect of the Cold War, making that literary testimony that falls between documentary evidence and a story of survival of one's trust in language that has been mutilated by oppression. A language that was both used to communicate, and it communicated us in our upheaval, seeing language as a manifestation of ourselves, not simply as a mode of communication. The language of war in Owen's case, the language of secret police surveillance in my case, become intrinsic parts of the poetic language as their sum expresses historical upheaval. And as I said before, the canvas of suffering, which we all experience. This is the soul of paraphrase in relation to history, the tormented but constantly renewing, regenerating soul. And I would like to offer my poem, A Birthday Letter, based on a secret police transcript of visiting my father in prison when I was 17 years old. And it's a memory I lost until I found the record, and it has brought back that visit to mind. A Birthday Letter is an example of the meditation on the intersection between the public language of surveillance and the private language of family during the Cold War. But the poem itself, because it has been published and because I wrote it for an audience, it's part of the public discourse. And so you see how complicated this is, this private effusion of feelings, this private expression of pain, because it's published, now bears the responsibility of published language, which is public language, therefore communicating a sense of public emotion, a historical truth. A birthday letter. The words, "the source informs you," echo in my head that other voice, familiar, comfortable almost, lining our private cries. The inmate wrote to his wife and children from the Ayut prison. Our letters journeyed through the clay-like maze of secret police desks, stamps, checks, dates, signatures, indicate officers and places. The paraphrase of ongoing pain. Half the time they paraphrase us. That voice in introductions sticks to our words like a skin disease impossible to cure. But then some sentences from us burst free, perhaps because they're not translatable, editable, condensable. They stand out in quotation marks and spring at me now like unexpected heartbeats. On 4 May 1985, my father thought about his birthday. Make a cake with 50 candles and take a picture. I remember the cake on the table in a winter kitchen and myself thinking about him in chains all day. My dear, the children are healthy, mother said. Come and see me with my children, he said. Do you remember me coming home with snow on my brow? A letter says. Children, I so much miss you. I kiss you all and your mother and me. How beautiful it would have been for you to have been here too. Sell everything you can, he urged. Send the children to school. Do not despair. I might be coming home soon. We hung on to those words that would cross the clay-like murky territories between us and show faint hope. These letters were like skin that covered and protected our bodies from the cold outside. Each word the capillary that carried and supported the life in each one of us. Each word was limitless, clothed our souls and warmed against despair, shielded us from their world of terror, transported chills, shivers, anger, warmth from us to Father and back from him to us. They took us to each other as we were. When the censor took our words and talked about them, discarded our handwriting and wrote his, he became a flaying instrument. Letters we sent were not received until now, 30 years on. We, Marcias, the satyr, tied to our tree. The censor scraped at capillaries of our words. What survives is howling. A year has passed with no news from you. Something awful is happening to you. No one looks after us anymore. We're all busy. They're all busy. Mother is ill and short-tempered. Even grandmother has left. It's an indignity. You have nothing to eat. 30 years have gone, and we have lived with exposed wounds, doubts, fears, uncertainties. Now I find the family letters from back then in a mist of thousands of records. I reconstruct the way we used to speak, the way skin used to feel when it was still alive, denatured letters in the handwriting of the censor. I can see capillaries under the flaying instrument. I reconstruct parts of the skin from the words that were copied out. We now know what has been taken from us and how words alone saved us then and bring joy now, the joy of finding them. For in their frail syllables, I recognize the old self. Apollo has cleaned his instrument and left. Research is a form of close observation. In this, I find it a powerful aspect of the process of composition, where symbols, similes, metaphors, and the sound of language are created to express that sense of self, the soul, that is altogether more than the sum of its parts. The poem then is a manifestation of the presence of language in our lives, a presence that inspires, teaches, and ultimately helps us shape who we are to one another.
Thank you, Carmen. That was truly, truly wonderful and very, very moving and so full of all sorts of things I'd like to hear you talk for hours and hours more. I have so many things I want to hear you say more about, but I'm conscious that I mustn't hog the question time. But I just wondered, gosh, when you were talking about Wilfred Owen and then went on to give that astounding poem of your own. Owen, of course, very famously and often kind of over-quoted perhaps, and certainly very often quoted out of context, says, as you said, the poetry is in the pity. But then what he goes on to do is say, all a poet can do today is warn. And I felt like what you then went on to do was so nuanced and so thoughtful and so much more than Owen's perhaps quite disingenuous claim that all we can do is warn, because what you've just shown us is that what we can do, in your lovely phrase, is kind of present the canvas of suffering. And that seems to me a much subtler and much more profound thing to do than just sort of warning journalism, shocking, dulce et coram est, this kind of thing. And I just wondered, I mean, you've talked so beautifully about it, I wondered if you could talk even more about this idea of kind of language as a manifestation of ourselves, and that it's both a canvas of suffering, but it's also, you were talking about the letters becoming your skin, the kind of self-defining through language and maintaining a sense of self, as well as perhaps warning, as well as representing the suffering that you experience. It's not a question, it's more of a waffle, but I just, more please, in short.
Well, thank you for this this question. I think when it occurred to me that language is really a manifestation, it was several times in my life. One was when I had to abandon a language and pick up another one to express myself. And that was part of, it's very strange because just now we are with my children. I am with my children at my parents' house. And, my father asked my children, why don't you speak Romanian more? Is it that you don't love Romania, or isn't that sense of, and I went back and I said, but you read my book where I explained why I didn't want to teach them in the first place. And then he brought that whole conversation back, but also the fact that now they're learning it and they're speaking it with their grandparents, despite it just shows how language can help us conquer ourselves and our fear, and how so much language is what we are. We are what we speak. The second time that this sort of sense of revelation about language as a manifestation of one's, I would say, deepest self, because we have our own ways of expressing ourselves, was when I got the secret police files. Because when I began reading the letters that we sent to each other and the transcripts of the conversations, in the Romanian language, I caught that, as I tried to capture in a poem, I caught that sense of the old self. And it was shockingly emotional that this is a Carmen, this is a teenager who I buried somehow because I wanted to heal myself. And this is a self that represents a historical moment, not because I think myself as grand as history, but because, as I said, it's a spot on that canvas of suffering that you know that you've been suppressed. In my book Poetry and the Language of Oppression, I talk about this triangle of oppression from the outside, suppression, which is self-censorship, driving yourself silent, and expression, the power of poetry to manifest the soul, to break through, to come in like water goes over rocks, in a riverbed. And that's, in a sense, that's again I wasn't aware till I read The Fires just how powerful language is in bringing the self alive, and in also in stifling the self. So this is what I'm trying to deal quite a bit, because you notice in situations of domestic abuse or intimidation, and now with coronavirus, we are noticing how people are scared to be with each other, how people, the anxiety that we have, even about how we talk about vaccines, how we talk about meeting in the office, how we talk about seeing our family who has been flying on planes and all this. It's all in the language, right? We try to shape the language in order to allow ourselves to come through, but only a little bit. It takes a long time to have the courage to let the full self express itself. So that's what I'm working on. I think it's so hard, and with research and poetry, I find myself both constrained by the documents, because it has to be those words and they have to be placed in the correct and historical context of the Cold War, of surveillance. But then at the same time, I have this urge to say, but this is what it's like to be there. And this is where metaphor can come in. This is where the capillaries of the words come in. This is where Paula and Marcia's come in for that expression. So they work so beautifully together, I think, the research and that testimony.
I just wondered if I might ask one more thing, Carmen, about this phrase that you use: published language is public language. This change from between the private and public. Thinking particularly about poems that are found in or draw directly from public documents. Wondered if you could tell us a little bit more about that.
Yes, so I mean, we are seeing so not only poems published or based on documents, but poems as published language and as public language. Once they come in into the public sphere, they become part of the public discourse, and I think it's something that poets are refusing to acknowledge so much, not because they are afraid of taking responsibility for what they put out there, but because I think because they feel the weight of that. What do you mean? It's my feelings. I'm not responsible for anybody's reaction to what I'm expressing myself. But I think we cross that boundary between what we feel at home, sitting down with a piece of paper or at the computer, and what others will feel as a result of reading what we wrote. And here is when we come to, I suppose, the most politicized aspect of literature these days, when we are talking about poetry and social justice and responsibility and witnessing and all this, when we are called into to witness, and when we are called in to make the world better with the poem, and then we fall into preaching, or we fall into, it's so difficult to cross that boundary without feeling self-conscious about where do these words take us. And then to go closer to your point, many people write found poetry. They cut up things from the newspaper, where they take things from the news, where they respond. In one case, I responded with the poem about when there were the protests here in the States last year, the Black Lives Matter protests. There was at some point a picture going around the Twitter with a policeman pointing his gun at a girl, at a very, very tiny Black girl on the shoulders of her father. She was holding a bag of crisps. And I just felt so shaken by that photo. I just remember getting goosebumps and crying when I saw that. And I wrote the poem, "Do Not Point Your Gun at a Child," in response to the photo. That's, again, that wasn't simply just my reaction my gut reaction of, oh my God, you're a man with a gun in America at a public protest where a kid is holding a bag of crisps. What are you thinking? It wasn't just that. It was more of, I hope I speak something that other people want to say. And then here I had to be very careful. Do I take on the mantle of a spokesperson? How do I say this without speaking from a high moral standing? How do I hit that nerve where I am allowed to just speak my instinct, but the instinct would be right? Because when people would see it, they would recognize something of themselves in it. So this is what I mean about that sort of responsibility also to describe the photo, to make sure that the photo is traceable, and to make sure that that was the correct moment in which I wasn't taking it out of context, and I wasn't talking about, you know, something else with it, another country, another place, another political situation. So it makes it very, it makes it, to me, very fascinating, because here we have, I'm not sure, and this is, I would like you to talk about this, you know, at this conference, you know, can poems be fact-checked? I argue in my book, Poetry and the Language of Oppression, that you can't use the poems as court testimonies, but you can use the poems as that understanding of the human soul in suffering, because that cannot be ignored, okay? Because it isn't erasable. This is where the poetry has its freedom to work together with the research. And if we think, Kate, if we think of all the East European poets, because this is my sort of backwoods where I grew up, if we think of Akhmatova in Mandelstam, if we think of Nadezhda Mandelstam, who memorized her husband's poems and then wrote Hope Against Hope, and if we think of all the other ones, Miloš, for example, and then we go back to think of Heaney. I've worked on Heaney and the East Europeans. They do represent moments of historical duress, don't they? We turn to their poetry and we say, all right, with Heaney, we know about the conflict in Northern Ireland and what it means to sit between two conflicted countries and try to bring a prayer for the better of both places and a self-healing. And we know about, you know, the East European poets. We know that we always associate them with Stalin, don't we? And socialist realism. And we are aware also that, for example, socialist realism was a very political, very doctrinal, and very toxic thing that was imposed on the writers. And this is where we had sort of the art for art's sake becoming not simply, I choose to ignore what goes on around me, I'm just focusing on my art, but really becoming a great political statement that we need to protect the creative space of the writer. So it's very hard to have it both ways. I'm arguing in my book, but you can't have it both ways if you're truthful about what you're saying.
Brilliant, thank you, Carmen. What a fascinating way of placing poetry. I think, you know, a little bit from the perspective of a life writer, not that I want to reduce everything back to biography, because that's what I do rather than poetry, but being able to see the subtleties of poetry as not being something that might stand up in a court, but something that tells you something about the texture of the human soul and that kind of sense of the kind of intangibility of what it is to exist and what it is to be someone. Is a really such a clear resonant image for me as to how I might address poetry within trying to understand how to articulate who someone was, which is of course your job when you're writing about lives. There are a number of questions as well as many very, very admiring comments. Malika Booker has written a question in the chat. And she says that she wonders about process the move from receiving the tapes to deciding to write, to the discoveries you gained writing through and into this history. How did the tapes act as stimulus, poetic raw material, and the act of writing? I suppose I'm interested in the body and the act of writing. Could you tell us a bit more about that, the body and the act of writing?
Yeah, so the tapes, we still haven't had access to the actual audio tapes. We have seen all the transcripts. And the process of researching was very strange because it was like sitting in a Bodleian. We had to travel to the government archives to Bucharest. I had to acquire the signatures of my parents giving me permission to look at their documents. I had to, obviously, I had my own file there within my parents' documents. And it was really sitting in a reading room where people came with this big piles of folders and gave them to us, and then there were pictures in the folders and all of this. How did that get into the writing? I suppose that experience, this is what I wanted to say in today's talk as poetry and the soul, in paraphrase. An experience challenges the soul. It changes it. An experience, and an experience like this was very powerful in a sense of, again, making me revisit painful moments, but also making me reconsider who am I in light of this? Because my life is narrated, is documented, is researchable, is to some extent publicly available to researchers. And I don't really have a say in that. It's the records. And I know that those were colored by a particular intent, and the intent was to portray the family as unpatriotic. That's a huge blow to have to one's sense of self. What do you mean we are unpatriotic? What do you mean we were social garbage? How do you even begin to think about all of those things? And so that experience in itself has informed the next stage of my writing as somebody with the story already told. That was something for me to think about for a number of years. What am I now? I told my story in Bearing the Typewriter. I told my story in Crossing the Carpathians. And memory, I've challenged the memory, and I brought the memories that sort of gave me a coherent sense of self. What do I do with these memories that some I don't have anymore? Some have been implanted by the records. Why implanted? Because, well, I certainly wasn't around there when my father had conversations with my brother and he was reciting poetry to my brother. I certainly wasn't there, but then now became part of this conglomerate of family memories that I wasn't present for. So there is all that complexity added to it. And when it becomes a body of work, as you're saying, the body of work in the poems, I had to be very careful again at how, well, there was the question first, am I destroying the poetic language? Am I committing sacrilege against my own profession by letting this horrifying material, this terrible language come in? Or what is it that I want to do with it? This was the main question that I had to put to myself. For whose edification do I do this? Why am I putting this language? And what risk do I have of being misunderstood as a poet, of being seen as somebody who's just, doing things to look interesting, technically, putting the records into poetry, but not. There were many ethical questions also about, do I put all the names of the informers? Do I put all the names of the other people? How do I deal with these documents with real people? What had transpired at the end was a willingness, in a sense, to say, but when you are oppressed, you are stunted. Your growth is stunted. your very language is denatured. Your sense of memory is vitiated, is betrayed. Your sense of possibility, it becomes more sinister. You see more of, so I want to put everything into poetry. So I decided, all right, let it all migrate in. I'll put the files and I'll let them talk to each other. At some point, I also had like file on one page and poem as a response on the other page. So I also wanted to make it transparent to the reader. This is the file. This is the direct translation of it without any effort to improve anything. But this is what I took from it. This is what it means to me. So in that sense, I aimed for complete transparency with it. So it's a body of work that incorporates history, that incorporates family suffering. And I thought that the lyric language is generous enough to allow this weight to be placed on it at certain parts, at certain, so you know, it's like a net. Let's say the lyric language is like a net that has to carry all these things in it. Well, like a canvas bag that has to carry all these weights inside of it. That's how I've come to think of it.
That's an absolutely fascinating image. So we have a question from Elika Burma, if she would like to turn her microphone on. Hello, Elika.
Hello.
A question from Collins afterwards. So over to Elika.
I don't know if it's a question or a comment. It's about memory and language and poetry, and it's just been so inspiring and thought-provoking, everything you've been sharing with us, Carmen. And you may actually, in what you were just saying about the poems and the tapes and kind of putting them on one side of the page and the poem on the other, and you know, retrieving those memories, you may already actually have been speaking to my question. But yeah, I suppose I was just wondering if you could reflect a bit more on kind of the operations of memory in poetry. You know, you were saying you told your story in Crossing the Carpathians, you told your story in Burying the Typewriter, and then these tapes came to light and they provided a different kind of memory, a different sort of store of memory. When you were telling your story, you were, as it were, you know, sinking into your own memories and bringing them out in the form of poetry. Now you had almost a kind of another film, you know, another set of images, a kind of replacement memory. And I was just wondering whether that has created a kind of, you know, war or quarrel in your mind between different kinds of memory. I mean, to be really flippant and ridiculous, but just sort of to pinpoint what I'm trying to say, you know, sometimes, because I'm always losing things, always, and sometimes what I most long for is a little camera on my wall that will show me where it is I've put, you know, my keys, that very special notebook that I was using, and so, you know, I there's my memory, and then there's a kind of the record that I sometimes long for. Anyway, it's not really a question. I'd just love to hear you talk a bit more about the tapes and your own memories.
Yeah, so if you look at those tapes and if you look at those records and if you go to the archives, as somebody who's outside my story and outside my own head, what you will get is a public record of the Cold War surveillance and one particular dissident and his family. Yes, this is the state record. And for better or worse, whatever they chose to put in there, and I know the gaps, and I know this is where the anger comes in, and this is where the frustration comes in. And my whole argument that history is written by those who win over, and a lot of times they're liars, they set it up, and then this is where I have to come in screaming on the side of the road saying, I'm outside, but I know the truth is there, is not there. poets often do that. They can do that. And I'm grateful for writing, you know, for my voice as a writer to bring that out. Because the unacknowledged citizen, the person who doesn't write, will never be heard. That's clear. That's another aspect of public language that I wanted to bring in. The poet as a voice, that the person who is the unacknowledged one, the one who goes to work as a nurse, as a doctor, as a car mechanic, will never tell their story. And it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Yes. So that's one part, but that's the secret police records are a public official document that we could go, you could go to East Berlin and access the Stasi files, you could go there and okay. But then there is the language of memory, the personal language of memory, which in my mind is like the river of Heraclitus. You cannot step in it twice. It's always the Danube, but every time you put your foot in it, there's something else that comes from upstream. It's never exactly the same one. And every time you remember, it becomes, it depends on how you remember it, the context in which you remember it, how old you are when you know, the time in your life, the experiences in your life. If you're going through something very difficult and you remember certain things, you remember them in a different way than you would remember it if you were happy over a glass of wine with somebody. It's very different. Memories, what I'm trying to say, they're fluid, and the language of memory is fluid. Doesn't mean is not true. I mean, you do have people who say, oh God, you know, it's not true. That isn't true. It means you remember it according to your feelings at that time. It's exactly the same factual information, but that might make you sad at the moment you remember it more than you were sad at the moment you remembered it first. So this is what I was talking about, the initial shock about the files, and then the possibility of poetry, which I find extraordinary as a mode of self-knowledge as well, the possibility of poetry to sit down and reflect on it. And as I worked to sort of chisel those images and to settle in those images and to make those memories more permanent, yes, to give them weight against the permanence of the record, while I was working with the fluid memory, yes, when I was trying to bring them all together and integrate them into these images, which are now going to stay as poems. Therefore, they would be transmitted as such, as any record of oral tradition has passed on to the printed tradition, yes? Then that also, it's yearning for some stability. I'm sure when I will be 80 years old and I'll remember the visit to prison to my father, I would be much wiser and sort of at the end of a life well lived. And then I would say, yes, that was part of my life. I would look with some kind of detachment and maybe some affection into those moments. But when I first read it, I felt raped. I felt violated. It's like, why did you put, how could you bore into my soul with this? How could you write, how can you preserve this? At the same time as I was happy that it was there, because there it is. I mean, it's there as something that happened and I'd forgotten. You know, the very title of the file, you know, Bugan at an audience with his daughter. I mean, so formal, that language. I mean, this was not an audience at some embassy. It was a dirty prison room with glass wall between us when we were trying to tell each other that we loved each other, despite the fact that, you know, he was tortured on one side of the wall and I was horrified on the other side of the wall. So, I mean, these things are things that what falls between the cracks of human experience and human reasoning about the experience is this poetry that sort of, when it falls through, it catches, you know, like I said, these colors that we put on a canvas of human suffering. And we have them there, so people know that it's not so easy it's not so easy to be nasty to each other. It's not so easy to take control of entire countries, that ideologies are both to be, respected, but, properly analyzed before they are being reinforced and put in circulation without a certain, meditation on a language and on what they represent. So it brings a lot of things out. And that's through the question of memory. I mean, I've written a paper, Secret Police Language and the Language of Memory, where I contrasted, the static, written in stone language of the records with my fluid memory, where I allowed myself to remember, and I didn't care if I didn't remember certain things. That's, it's like you were saying, you lose stuff and you wish you had, a camera to say where you've walked through the room. My son does, he walks through the same rooms again, and he says, if I just walk over there and if I stand in the same position, I'll remember what I put the paper with the book. We all have different ways of doing things.
Fantastic, Carmen. Thank you so much. Katie Collins, you have a question, I believe.
Me, that question about memory and when you're multitasking, you can't remember things. Can you? So good luck to me if I can remember this question, because I'm multitasking all of it. My question for Carmen is about hierarchies, I think. And I was also thinking about Amit's talk and the panel, the first discussion panel that we heard from, that touched on research as a kind of higher status in the hierarchy of sort of legitimizing poetry or novels or creative writing. And I was thinking, Carmen, of your beautiful metaphor, colours on the canvas of suffering, which is obviously a reference to painting and to fine art. And I was thinking of the obvious comparison to draw, which is for practicing poets, is the metaphor of craft in poetry. And it reminded me of Will Harris's essay in the Nine Arches Press book on craft. And he's quite sort of scathing about craft as a metaphor. He sort of says it's like making a wardrobe, craft, whereas making a poem is making art. And it struck me that there's another hierarchy there between art and craft, as well as between poetry and research. And I'd love to know your thoughts on that.
Yes, so I gotta tell you this this little story about the sort of the hierarchy of the research and documents versus a sort of a personal story, or putting out a memoir. Bearing the typewriter had a very hard time getting placed at the beginning. So Deborah Rogers, when she was alive, she was very keen on a book, but she couldn't quite place it. And there was a turning point to that, is after I got access to the files. And I just remember, traveling to London to her office and say, oh my God, I got the files. And both publishers, the US and the UK one, when they found out about the files, though nobody told me that the files were the reason why they decided to actually go on and take the book, I had this gut feeling that somehow the documents, the actual files, legitimized the story that I was telling. Again, this is not to put any thoughts in my publishers' minds or to suggest that really they didn't believe my story till they found the files. But I did find the power of the documents as something that hooked people, that they were there, you could see them. And I found that the added value of also, sharing some of them also in my Releasing the Porcelain Birds and in my memoir. And I put some in my new book too now, Poetry and the Language of Oppression, not just to show that this is the truth and this is what happened, but also because it's a mode of discourse, isn't it? And it's a mode of public discourse, and it's important to show how it works and to show it for being there. It just offers that, but it does, Amit was quite right. It does, the research legitimizes is, you've done the research, you have the documents, and so therefore what you're saying must be more important than what you were saying by yourself, even though you knew it, or even though you've experienced it. So that's at least that's the first part of your question. There was another part of your question. You're saying that first was the research, and then
I was talking about the big metaphors of art and craft.
And yes, I mean I use the Alexander Pope, the quote, the little quote, those move easier who have learned to dance. There is an art in this, and I think there is also an art in trying not to look too artful. I sort of subscribe to that, simplicity, but as Eliot said, has to be hard earned. It doesn't just come as something that you blurt out and you say, well, this is a poem and it's real and therefore, it's true. What more do you want? It has value in itself. It has to be hard earned in a sense of, I could put this 10 different ways. What is my way that I think would communicate, best? The fact, as I was mentioning earlier, the connection between science and poetry, and I've been working with this on some presentations in science with my husband. That in itself is just to be able to observe something and to say something true about a particle. I've been writing limericks about the Higgs boson and stuff like this in a book we've been sort of writing forever about children, and explaining the Higgs field as a sunflower field and doing all of these things. It's so nice to be able to learn from someone the actual how do you say behavior of nature, something that you could as if you are writing about the cardinals, it's important to know that cardinals stay together forever, where this information, and to be able to describe something accurately, I think it lends this illumination to the poetic work, and then work with it to color it, to use something borrowed from art, from painting, to color it. But I wouldn't look in any way down on craft. It's not really, I mean, okay, I cannot make a closet either, a wardrobe, I cannot make it. So I think I would be quite stunned if I were able to pull that one up and get something that would hold my clothes together. That's such a potent metaphor, isn't it? It's like, oh my God, let's go there. So it's very, they work together, as I was saying before. The poem is much more than the sum of all of its parts, more than the research, more than inspiration, more than the feeling, more than the language accessible to the poet, because the poet has a certain, and again, here we are, research. Lucy Newland's The Craft of Poetry, a magical book, right? It's all based on researching and deep knowledge of the poetic forms and poetic methods and poetic language. And that cannot be overstated. We need all of that in order to produce that poem that we're so proud to share as public language, as published language with the readers.
You said just now it's so important, it's so wonderful when we can learn from someone, and I can safely say I've learned an enormous amount in the last hour, and I'm sure everybody else has too, and it's been a great privilege as always to hear you talk. Thank you very, very much indeed.
Well, thanks so much, Kate. It's so lovely to be with you, and thank you for the questions. It's wonderful, wonderful. I'm so happy to participate in this because it's such an important conversation. So thank you.